Hello, my name is Jason Johnson, and my multicultural integration project is entitled Labels, Stereotypes, and Identity Discrimination. And it's going to focus specifically on nationalism and the repercussions it presents in the United States. My motive for this inquiry focuses primarily on recent political developments in the modern world. I think this is happening everywhere. I think this is a topic that is not necessarily American, but I don't have all day to focus on the rest of the world, so I'm going to kind of angle my presentation and focus in on the United States, which, in the last, I would probably say, 10 to 15 years, we've seen an increase in irrational doctrines. We've seen a lot of extreme right wing movements, violence. And certainly there's, a political polarization that has developed, which has created this unique time that we live in. And it's also created a very detrimental nationalistic perspective. The premise, my premise is going to focus on how American nationalism has enabled our mainstream society to sharpen, strengthen, and boost its prejudicial points of view. And in turn, it's expanded the existing sense of racism, xenophobia, sexism, and homophobia, which is plaguing the United States. American nationalism is indeed detrimental to the American people, and its effects on the individual citizens within our society reveal a need for examination, discussion, and reform. And I think certainly, this thesis is something I think is very, very important to delve into. My emphasis, I'm going to really pay attention and focus in on the majority perspective, how they look at history, culture, and religion, and social perspectives in America. We're going to take a look at how this majority perspective reveals how the United States labels and stereotypes marginalized groups simply for the sake of nationalism. My expected outcomes. First, I want to take a moment to review what nationalism is and the types of nationalism. I want to investigate the negative outcomes of nationalism throughout human history. So I'm going to take a moment and just point out a few examples of that. I'm going to take a look at how nationalism has been presented in literature, how it's changed. Um, I think how literature has taken the opportunity for us to just kind of be aware of what these things can do, to explore how individual identity is shaped by labels and stereotypes created by the dominant majority of a society. I'm going to take a look at that specifically. I want to examine some social, cultural, and historical perspectives, all related to these topics. And certainly, my goal here is to promote empathy, diversity, and unity within society. That's the purpose of this. And my main purpose is just to encourage discourse, debate, and reflection on these things. And we're going to take a look at critical social justice, and how this is certainly necessary in the times that we live in the United States. So first, I want to start off with talking about stereotypes. As a language arts teacher, certainly stereotype is something that we discuss. And when I discuss stereotype in my classroom, I take a moment to make sure that I teach the difference between a literary stereotype versus a harmful stereotype that's presented in society. So, and those two things really are important. In literature, stereotypes certainly can be very helpful for students to really understand the characterization and the intent of the writer, like, trying to develop a character. However, obviously in society, stereotypes can have a very negative and detrimental effect, and it's something that we want to make sure that we take a look at. Positive stereotypes and negative stereotypes, something that's really, really important too, is understanding that even positive stereotypes can be negative. So when you say women are naturally warm, nurturing, and make better parents, yes, it's very positive. Asians are naturally smart and great at math. Black people are great dancers. Gay people are so much fun. Again, these stereotypes can lead to unrealistic expectations. And, sometimes it puts unnecessary stress on the person who might fit that, or who may not fit that stereotype per se, but may fit that group of people. So obviously, negative stereotypes are things that we want to avoid. Some of these stereotypes are stereotypes that my students have posted. When we've done an exercise, to identify what stereotypes are. Women can't drive. Asians are sneaky. You can't trust them. Black people are lazy. Gay men are pedophiles. So these are things, obviously, in my classroom that students have pointed out, and we've talked about these stereotypes and the effects that they have, and how they can lead to negative situations for the individual. That comes down to labels. Labels and stereotypes, even though they're similar, labels are terms that are used to describe people. Stereotypes are assumptions. The big thing is both of these can affect how others think about people. And here's some examples. And certainly, calling someone unworthy or ugly or fat or weak, or you identify someone as being selfish or hopeless or a loser. This definitely has an effect on someone's individuality and their identity development, especially when they're young. And teaching high school, I like to have these discussions, and we talk about words that we use, and how we want to be aware of what we say and how we say it and who we say it to and who we say it about. Which leads us into identity and discrimination. And, within society, we have all of these identities and all of these different groups of emphasis. For instance, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, gender expression is a big one, and has become, very politicized in the last 15, 20 years. So I think these things are really, really important to discuss, and certainly these are going to be examined through the eyes of nationalism as we continue. So one of my main sources for my topic is Dr. Robin DiAngelo. I was asked to read Is Everyone Really Equal in one of my graduate classes, and she really inspired me to reflect and examine the way I kind of approach things. And so, what I've done is I've tried to continue the discussion of what I've learned from that book. I've actually read the next book, What Does It Mean to Be White? And I'm just purchased White Fragility and Nice Racism from Amazon. So those are going to be my next two reads. But one of the things that I find about Dr. Robin DiAngelo through my research, um, she's a professor. She's focused her research on being white and whiteness and the effects that it has. She's discussed all these things in critical discourse analysis, which I find very interesting. Certainly very life changing as an educator, which I think is something that's really important. Realizing that we can all continue to grow and changing our points of view, or our ability to recognize things through this kind of critical social justice, I think is something that's very important. So, my first real source, excuse me, was from one of her lectures that I found on Google, on YouTube. And I it's from her White Fragility book and her lecture, which I purchased the book, but I've not read it yet. I've not had the chance to start reading it yet. But I took some of the quotes and things from the video, and and these were things that stood out to me. Labels and stereotypes reveal human inequality explicitly, and there's no denying this. So I found that to be really important. Point of view is individual, and it shapes the essence of who we are. This is certainly something that I talk about in my literature classes. Point of view is one of the biggest standards in, English language arts that starts from, kindergarten, is understanding point of view. So I think it's really, really important in a literature class to explain. Not only is it important to understand point of view, but this is going to help you understand who you are and how you see others. Our identities are affected by thought provoking opportunities. I found that to be really powerful. She's affected me. We change while reflecting on others' perspectives and identities. Her perspective and her identity certainly has helped me see things. So I feel like my outlook has changed thanks to her. I don't believe it's humanly possible to be free of bias. I think that that is an honest truth, and I think that is part of the essence of her lecture in White Fragility. And I think that that's something that we all need to just kind of admit. It's part of who we are as human beings, which kind of ties into the whole idea of being educated and understanding other people and the power that we all have in what we say and what we do. Um, and so I just found that to be really powerful. We have always policed the bodies of people of color, and black people in particular. The Jim Crow South is a classic example. White fight in the North, school segregation, gerrymandering. So, she talks about the influence of white mainstream majority, and she talks about the history of these things. Currently, in our nationalistic situation in the United States, we are seeing politicians who are gerrymandering the political maps. And, this dialogue is changing the way things are happening and the way people are coming into power. And so I found this section to be very important, in terms of political control, political perspective, and nationalism. And this has kind of inspired me to kind of keep doing more research. And I think I'm going to spend some time even later really working on this. See where I go with it. Things to consider. Why are we afraid of each other? Who are we? Who have we become? What's at stake? The last election, and it's always kind of been this way. What's going to happen? X, Y, and Z. But I just really felt like this last election was extremely powerful. What's at stake was said a lot on both political spectrums. The Republicans and Democrats were, really pushing this, and in my opinion, things are not great, and I don't really know what's going to happen. And I think that there's a lot for us to kind of look at. What will become of us? Why are we so divided? How can we learn from what's happening? How can we come together? How can we unify our country? So, with these questions in mind and these things to consider, I think it's really important to kind of start off with, what our values are. And in this country, we value the idea that anybody, regardless of where they're born or what class they're born into, they are going to be able to attain their own version of success in America. And that is our dream. And I think that is something that we, all Americans on both political sides of the spectrum, we value this. And this is something that unifies us and it makes America very, very unique. This all goes back to the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, penned this so well. We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The reason why I put this in, obviously was to reinforce the American value that we all have the right to be happy and we all have the right to pursue the things that we want out of life, that those are our rights. Um, and I love the fact that, he makes the intentional effort not to use God, he uses creator, which kind of certainly reveals, hey, our religious intolerance matters. And that was one of the values that our founding fathers did have, which is something that kind of comes into question later when we start talking about what's happening in America. Back to the idea that we all are looking for our dreams. One of the things too that happened, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was this idea of the melting pot. An ideal America is where we all, regardless of where we come from, regardless of where we've immigrated from and our families have come from, that we are going to come together. And this was a really, really big thing that happened in the early 1900s. We are a society where different cultures and ethnicities blend together, and there was a time period where obviously this was this was something that was valued. And I think that's really, really important. We celebrated this iconic metaphor of the melting pot. Where that came from, it came from a play by Israel Zangwill. He was an Anglo-Jewish author. He was son of immigrants, and he obviously was influenced by his experiences with his family moving from Germany to here. And so he explains this, this in a play. And this is kind of where that whole idea of the melting pot caught on. Sangville says, America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Germans and Frenchmen and Irishmen and Englishmen and Jews and Russians into the crucible with you all. God is making the American. And I find that to be amazing, that at that time period in the early 1900s when he wrote this play, he was able to really communicate this idea that this is a test of our faith, of who we are in America. And that, he's able to really pin the idea that God is making the American. I just thought that it was a very brilliant way for him to kind of communicate this. He did so in a religious way in my opinion, persuade people to really understand it doesn't matter where you come from. We're all trying to be this thing called the American. So, one of my favorite writers also was influenced with this idea of what is an American and how we're made. Amy Tan is a Chinese American, wonderful writer. I've read quite a few of her books, but one of my favorite books of all time is The Joy Luck Club. And the big thing that this book did for me, and it had a profound effect on me, was helped me truly understand someone else's view of our culture And I read this book, I want to say in the early 90s, maybe like 95, 96. And I think there was a movie that came out as well. But it really, really helped me appreciate this view of what an American is through an outsider's point of view. So, what did she do? She took, a familial approach, family, and especially mother daughter relationships. And I thought it was really, really cool how she was able to communicate these concepts. These ideals of hope, faith, and love, which they're obviously Chinese ideals as well, and kind of how they come together with these mother daughter relationships. I'd like to share the first part of her book, which is it's a parable, and I think it's a really really cool kind of connection and expression of one of the points that I want to make. Feathers from 1,000 li away. The old woman remembered a swan she had bought many years ago in Shanghai for a ridiculous sum. This bird, boasted the market vendor, was once a duck that stretched its neck in hopes of becoming a goose. And now look, it is too beautiful to eat. Then the woman and the swan sailed across an ocean many thousands of li wide, stretching their necks towards America. On her journey, she cooed the swan. In America, I will have a daughter just like me. But over there, nobody will say her worth is measured by the loudness of her husband's belch. Over there, nobody will look down on her, because I will make her speak only perfect American English. And over there, she will always be too full to swallow any sorrow. She will know my meaning because I will give her this one, a creature that became more than was hoped for. But when she arrived at the new country, the immigration officials pulled her swan away from her, leaving the old woman fluttering her arms and with only one swan feather for a memory. And then she had to fill out so many forms she forgot why she had come and what she had left behind. Now the woman was old, and she had a daughter who grew up speaking only English and swallowing more Coca Cola than sorrow. For a long time now, this woman had wanted to give her daughter one, or the single feather, and tell her, this feather may look worthless, but it comes from afar and carries with it all my good intentions. And she waited year after year for the day she could tell her daughter this in perfect American English. I really find this to be very profound. I find it to be extremely helpful in my understanding of perspective, point of view, identity, the creation of one's identity. I just think it's a perfect way to kind of discuss this. Um, Certainly, it has a lot to do with stereotype. Certainly, it has a lot to do with labels, the concept, in the United States and our nationalistic view of Asian Americans, um, especially in terms of their ability to speak, and their desire to speak English. I know for a fact that there's been so many stereotypes of Asian Americans and the negativity behind, who they are, um, and really what they can contribute and those kind of things. So what I want to do though is just take a look at this section for a second. This swan feather may look worthless, but it comes from afar and carries with it all of my good intentions. This mother is coming from, China, and obviously the expectation of women and the view of women is quite different than it is in the United States, which it took her obviously the opportunity. Hey, I can't wait to get there. My daughter is going to be much better for this. But then we see that the culture has changed her daughter so much that she's struggling with it. She's struggling with her decision to come there. And in the book, Tan does such a good job of really trying to understand, how the mother is able to cope with all these cultural changes. Same thing with the daughters. They're struggling to understand why their mothers want them to be perfect and they feel like they can't live up to this expectation. So the sense of identity here is a very key theme, and certainly I think it reflects a nationalistic theme, which I found to be very key in what we're talking about. So again, so many people around the world see America as this beacon of hope and freedom. And there for a while that we pride ourselves on that. I'm not so sure now, though, that our nationalistic view allows us to do that, that we have that view, that, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is for everyone in the world. There for a while, it seemed like the United States was welcoming people. Well, that doesn't seem to be the viewpoint now. So where does this come from? Patriotism and nationalism should not be confused. Being a patriot means that we love our country, we love our nation, we love our values, which those, I've pointed those out. Nationalism, on the other hand, is the belief that your nation is better. It is at the top of this hierarchy that, we've created. Um, it seems more ice that there it seems more like this country is focused on isolating itself a little bit instead of engaging in the world. And I think that's certainly where we are with Donald Trump, who's just been elected, and a lot of the policies and things that he's trying to incorporate. And, over the last probably 20, 25 years, there's just been this whole political debate on whether we're going to stay a part of NATO, and what are we going to do with immigration and the laws, are we going to send people back? I mean, it's just been a very, very painful time for our country, and I think the nationalistic view has put our patriotic view with people at odds with one another, and it's like the nationalistic view is trying to redefine what it means to be a patriot. But I think looking at these two definitions is really, really important to kind of understand that. So, nationalism. What is nationalism? Nationalism is certainly this idea that your country is the best, and that this ideology means that your loyalty, devotion, and allegiance to the country means that everything else doesn't matter. Um, and, this is certainly an easy way to look at things throughout history. When you look at the Napoleonic era in France, the whole idea of Vive la France is one of those things I think that comes to mind. Um, and if you study Napoleon and study that time period, you really see how nationalism really drove this imperialistic view and this just utter disregard for the individual and the minority in France and the other regions, Belgium, Luxembourg, these other countries. And I found that to be interesting to study, as a student, but certainly it's an example of nationalism that's outside of the country that you could kind of look at and hopefully learn from. So here we are. We've obviously not taken a look at the Napoleonic era. Some of our politicians certainly haven't. And so we're here in America today, 2024, and we're taking a look at the dangers of American nationalism. So, first and foremost, our Constitution, thanks to James Madison, who penned it so well, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And right now, those values and those goals and core promises in our Constitution are not only at odds with what's happening in our nationalistic viewpoint, I find it to be detrimental to the point where these values that are stated in the Constitution are getting ready to kind of not just be ignored, but in many, many ways to be completely changed and morphed into this ridiculous view. And I think that's happening through misinformation, disinformation. I think that our goals, I say our, the that sense of nationalism is really changing us into this isolationist country where we're not really wanting to work with other people. We're kind of wanting to build this wall around ourselves. It's creating xenophobia. It's increasing it. It's increasing xenophobic views. Racial and ethnic violence, I feel like, is on the rise. I think that the discourse that's being communicated politically is encouraging that. One of the scary ones for me is this rise in Christian nationalism and how these things are kind of coming together. That's certainly promoting religious intolerance and homophobia. My source for this discussion kind of comes from well, it does come from this article called The Danger of Christian Nationalism. And my link right there is at the bottom. But it was a very excellent kind of view of this. It was very enlightening and certainly something that really made me think and reflect on my feelings that I've been having for the last 15 years. So it was a really good read. Um, Obviously a historical example other than Napoleon. Let's take a look at probably the most feared one is Hitler. Nationalists doesn't just love their country. They see the world as a power struggle between nations and believe their nation should win that power struggle. It is different from patriots who love their culture and country without comparison or feelings of superiority over other nations and cultures. Obviously, the Nazi Party is an example of something that I feel we've not obviously learned these lessons. I don't think people really are able to compare what they're saying today versus what the German people were kind of forced into thinking and believing then, especially the propaganda. So, examples of nationalism include xenophobia, intolerance, isolationism, expansionist military crusades, enacting anti immigrant policies due to xenophobia. Nationalism can lead to discrimination and prejudice, whereas patriotism is positive because it represents love of a nation without the sense of superiority and that nationalists have. So I do think that that is something we need to kind of keep remembering. It's totally different than being a patriot. So, what does nationalism ultimately do? It addresses one of the most common conflicts, an individual's viewpoint versus that viewpoint of society, and just feeling left out. And I think that's something that when we're talking about identity and identity development, stereotypes, labels, I think that nationalism really heightens that. The mainstream majority of any society can pose a threat to those individuals who do not match or comply with the majority. We must educate and promote our national ideals of equity, social justice, and inclusivity. I think as an educator, I think it is our absolute must. We have to do this. This cannot be something that we forget. So, critical social justice, in my opinion, is something that we've got to find a way to incorporate. I think that that's easier said than done. I think that the groups of people that are they're most affected by this are marginalized groups, which include people of color, LGBTQ people, indigenous people, people with disabilities, people of lower socioeconomic status, and certainly women. And something that this election really taught me, the last two women, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, to intelligent, brilliant, capable, successful, accomplished women have lost to a man who, in my opinion, has been found to be horrible, a horrible human being, selfish. He just represents, in my opinion, some of the worst qualities of a human. He has been elected twice. And in our society, I stop and I'm just like, what are women supposed to do? What are women supposed to think? Where are women honestly supposed to find um, opportunities in this country when they see this happen? Because this message is so destructive and so detrimental. And I just feel like that teachers and educators have so much more work to do. We've got to find a way to break through this. So, the different types of nationalism include cultural, civic, ethnic, economic, and religious nationalism. In my classroom, there are times that, as I've taught history as well, but I do try and include the opportunity to talk about these things in my classroom. One of the opportunities that I have to talk about nationalism in my senior English class is when we talk about the British Romantics. The one positive thing that the British Romantics did was really, really encourage all of these British nationalistic ideas that kind of helped unify a, that region in a very good, positive way. The Romantic movement focused on emotion, imagination, and the connection to nature, which was great. This philosophy created an influential platform for expressing national sentiments, and that was one of the things that was very helpful for them, particularly through literature. With so many amazing writers, I just felt like that, that was one way, even today, when we talk about literature and we talk about all these amazing British writers. But the Romantics really kind of helped pull all of that together. So I do use that opportunity in my English class to talk about the positives of nationalism through literature. Certainly, literature is able to help us kind of communicate those kind of things. Now, civic nationalism, which is the most common form of nationalism, in my history classes when I've taught American U.S. history, this was something that I always tried to explain is that civic nationalism is where we're promoting this idea that we're all equal, that we're all the same, and that we encourage the diversity of our thoughts and religious beliefs, and we're okay with that. So, certainly civic nationalism is something that is very, very positive. Now, ethnic nationalism is very difficult to find positives through that, but in my lessons, when I've taught anything dealing with the Holocaust, anything that deals with India, when the Brits came in and partitioned all those different parts of India. Anytime I've taught anything dealing with Africa, how the Europeans came in and partitioned different places, the slave trade, all these different things, and opportunities to teach ethnic nationalism, I've taken the opportunity to do that. But ethnic nationalism, in my opinion, is something that obviously is very detrimental. When we start talking about immigration and the rules and laws of the United States, this is going to come down to our ethnic origins. And I think it can be very discriminatory and very dangerous. And certainly that's something that people need to be educated on. And I think it's obviously a thread and a vibe in current nationalism that is very, very evident. So, speaking of something else that's really, really scary and really, really evident in today's nationalism and or nationalistic view in the United States is religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is the fusion of religion and nationality. I think one of the biggest examples, and something that I teach my juniors, deals with the English Puritans who immigrated to the New World, and their goal was to create a society in which religion and government were the same. Today, the Christian nationalists, that's kind of their idea. And it's kind of scary, and I don't think that people have really stopped and thought, hey, this has already happened. What are we doing? So, this is one of the lessons that I teach in my junior class. We focus on John Winthrop, who was a Puritan. He served as a governor in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, is something that we read and we talk about. He created the metaphor city upon a hill, which again kind of reflects that idea of America being a beacon, a place for hope and inspiration. I think obviously there's an opportunity for that. However, I think this can be dangerous. I think it's a misunderstanding, and I think it's people are misinformed about the religious formation of our country, and I think it's something that we need to kind of educate people on. We shall find that God of Israel is among us when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. So basically, here he's telling us we want to make people jealous of what we have and what we've accomplished. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work that we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So here I think that this is something for John Winthrop to be very proud of. Hey, look what we've accomplished, and we want others to see hello. But this message is also very dark, and it's in my opinion quite sinister in terms of religious intolerance, because the Puritans were so critical of the Catholic and the Church of England religious viewpoints, and they weren't tolerable of people in their own culture. And that's something that I kind of see, growing within this Christian nationalistic view, which is trying to take hold of us. So it's certainly something that we have to look at. And, the concept of theocracy, which means that there is no separation of church and government, is something that's really scary. When I took a look at this book, I will tell you, one of my friends had this book and I started reading through it. It's called Christian Nationalism, a Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion and Discipling Nations. Just FYI, I refuse to list this as one of my sources. I found it to be, in my opinion, despicable. It made me nauseous, but I did want to at least point it out, and this is kind of how I connected these things. This book is a guide for Christians to take dominion and disciple their families, churches, and all nations for the glory of Jesus Christ, our King. And this is not me being anti religious, this is simply noting the separation of church and state and realizing, that people's religious arrogance and religious intentions are far more detrimental than people realize. And I think, again, it comes back, with the lack of intelligence, the lack of humility, the lack of compassion, and certainly the lack of tolerance. And I think that's what's something that's really, really scary. This kind of goes into one of my other sources. After I've looked at this, I wanted to take a look at hegemony and the hegemonist kind of viewpoint. particularly with when we're talking about nationalism. Social, cultural, economic dominance is something that this focuses on, this term. This video provides an example of, Nazi Germany, and the mainstream majority of any society can pose a threat to those individuals who do not match or comply with the majority. We must educate and promote our national ideals of equity, social justice, and inclusivity. I find that to be so important. This little video, it was only like, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 minutes, but it was really interesting. And it kind of helped tie some things together for me, and I wanted to point that out. So, as I've kind of pointed out, I feel like we're moving backwards. We've not looked at the lessons of history. Um, Looking at Catherine Stewart on Christian National's threat, this little article that I read, she says that Trump understood well the utility of bringing reactionary religious authorities onto his side. Um, there's so many people that question Donald Trump's faith, and they kind of look at his motives for doing some of the things that he's doing. I am certainly one of these people. Michelson is one of these people as well. I think that, you know, this sense of nationalism and his intentions of um, including religion in this is a way in which he's going to sway people. Um, and I just find this to be extremely dangerous and detrimental. And that's kind of what this article does. The next thing that it talks about in terms of fascism, and just a lot of white superiority, kind of bring all these things together. This article focuses on that. In this last quote, you can see a similar phenomenon happening with the Proud Boys, which is obviously a group that it's been in the news of late, and how they've supported, Donald Trump and his campaign. They came together mainly around racial and anti-feminist grievance, but they very soon began to embrace a certain kind of nationalist religion and identify with Christian nationalism. So it just seems that this whole movement is morphing into all these different things, which is becoming American nationalism, which again is going to target marginalized groups. It's going to affect people. It's going to look at the way people are individualized. So, obviously, being an English teacher, what can literature teach us? Um, I read, when I go back to D'Angelo's book, which I had to read in one of my classes, Is Everyone Really Equal? Um, I just found her understanding of identity and discrimination to be really just profound. And so I think that, again, I want to make sure that I go back to the source. Thus, effective critical social justice pedagogy will challenge mainstream opinions, and in doing so, will challenge our very identities. And I find that to be so just inspirational as a teacher. And again, I am 1 billion% committed to making sure that I teach my students point of view through this perspective. Now, obviously, I have to be very careful because, you know, take Moms for Liberty out of the equation. Just people who are very political, people who have been just completely uh, brainwashed in this current movement, this current nationalistic movement. They are going to target me. They're going to target my teaching. And I've seen it happen. I've experienced it already. And but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to stop. The one thing that I have on my side are my standards. I have my administrators. I have my colleagues. So again, literature is a way to help people understand, hey, let's take a look at the individual as well as our beliefs. and let's reflect on how all this works. And during the 1960s, when Harper Lee's novel came out, To Kill a Mockingbird, I felt like that's what she was trying to do. I felt like she was trying to speak to not just the people who read the book, she was trying to speak to America. And her character, Atticus Finch, which is, a lawyer defending a black man who's been accused of raping a white woman during the Great Depression in Alabama. So we're talking about a very politicized time period, a very politicized situation, a very politicized crime. And she creates a character who is able to really teach not just his child in the book, but the reader and the world. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside his skin and walk around in it. And I think that way in which he was teaching his daughter Scout is something that we need to remind people of. Stop being so judgmental. Stop being so quick, to take your own viewpoint first. And I just feel like that is the compassionate human way that Harper Lee took. And, she explores obviously other issues, which is amazing. Her character, Tom Robinson, who he is the black man who is accused of being, of raping a white woman. That racial stereotype that black males are sexual predators, she kind of tackles that. She also tackles, which I thought was very interesting, this idea of socioeconomic hierarchy with Bob Ewell, who he is obviously representing white trash. His ignorance, his poverty, and his anger, they all kind of come out with what he does to really communicate and try to persuade the white citizens of this town in Alabama, even though it's a lie, because he's so embarrassed that his daughter would be attracted to a black man. So ultimately, my discussion in response to this profound question, who are we? In my opinion, we just see that being socialized is one of the sinister repercussions of nationalism, and it's something that we kind of have to stop and think about. So, then I got another one, Dr. Seuss, who's one of my favorite writers. During his time in the 1930s, a lot of his work was kind of pointed at getting the United States involved in World War II simply because of what was happening to Jewish citizens in Europe. And, I felt like that even though at the beginning of his career, a lot of his work and things considered to be a little racist. I find that he kind of helped change that perspective of his work because he was a product of that time period. And I think that his change and his reflection on things certainly is reflected in his work, The Sneetches and Horton Hears a Who. I'm going to focus on The Sneetches, which I think teaches the lessons of inclusion and acceptance, but it also shows what being nationalistic can do and isolating your identity, what it can do. Um, Now the star belly sneetches had bellies with stars, the plain belly sneetches had none upon theirs. So we see this identity. Hey, I am this and you are not. I'm better than you, you are not. So Carol Miller, in her article, What the Sneetches Teach Us About Racism and Race, I found the article to be amazing. I felt like that this view of Dr. Seuss and ethnic nationalism is very key today. She really talks about how marginalized people really hold on to hurtful words and what those things do to people, their sense of identity and how they fit in. You know, I think it was a brilliant article. So another article that I found, which was really scary, deals with what's happening right now. Dr. Seuss is being banned? What? Yes, I couldn't believe it either. This is not delusionary. This is not hyperbolic. This is real. Linda Sexton talks in her article, Banning Dr. Seuss, that yes, there are movements to try to take away these children's books that are going to teach lessons of acceptance and unity. And so the quote, that day all the Sneetches forgot about stars and whether they had one or not upon Mars, which we see this lesson of identity to small children. But this is real. And in nationalistic America, our nationalism today in America is really making a movement to take literature away that's going to help teach compassion, humanity, inclusivity, all these things. And it's real. The Hunger Games is one of my favorite books. I wanted to bring it up simply because it focuses on authoritarianism, nationalism, and that idea of dystopian literature, which I think is very popular. And I think the reason why it is popular today is because of all of the political things that are happening in the world. And I think people are trying to find a way to deal with this. And certainly Suzanne Collins is able to kind of capture that. One of my favorite things that I kind of thought about is, what do the games actually represent? And I think the games represent, like, they're a metaphor for feeding people's appetite. Hey, we're going to choose people from different districts that are different than us and we're better than them, and we're going to learn about them. We're going to see if we really like them, but at the end of the day we're going to watch every single one of them die. And then the winner, we're going to really celebrate because they are going to be like us now. They're a winner. And I just feel like it is a brilliant way to attack nationalism. It's an excellent book. And these books were young adult, but they've become so popular, which I find to be amazing, and I think it's great. I wanted to speak about two things. So K. Monica and Dr. Meninaski, in their article, A Study on National Identity and Dystopian Society of Susan Collins' The Hunger Games Trilogy, they discuss these things. The Hunger Games set a model for modern dystopian fiction. Again, right now, I think that's very popular, and I think it came out at a time where people were really reacting to that. Dystopian fiction is set in the near future with a deteriorating civilization, people living in misery under the iron fist of totalitarian rule. I think for Americans, we're kind of looking at the possibilities of what could be, what could happen, and our attraction to this series and books like it. I think there's a reason for that. Dystopian literature often includes the following qualities: oppressive governments, loss of individuality, environmental destruction, technological control. Here's a big one: propaganda. Themes that include fear and hopelessness. And I think that for me, I mean, I can really connect with some of this idea of fear and hopelessness and what's going to happen being a gay man. I I find myself fortunate that I can read through the propaganda, on both sides of the aisle, but particularly with the Republican Party today, the misinformation, the purposeful disinformation. I feel so fortunate that I've been given that ability to do that. So, Pan Am, a shining capital ringed by 13 districts, which brought peace and prosperity to its citizens. And the irony behind that is death, fear, and totalitarian control is what brought peace and supposed prosperity. So it's very, very disinformational. And Susan Collins does a brilliant job to show that irony and reveal that. And the article, these two people really, really highlight that, which I found to be very interesting. Which leads us to The Handmaid's Tale, which is something that's very, very popular. I taught this book actually when I taught AP literature. So I find this book to be an amazing book. I also know that a lot of people are trying to ban this book. In many cases, some of my colleagues in different places in North Carolina and in Georgia, they've said, people are really upset with this book and what, the attack that it has on religious freedom. They'll use that argument, religious freedom is being attacked, and it's done so through school and people really trying to attack religion and Christianity through these stories. Well, I think Margaret Atwood's approach was kind of trying to show that, and certainly right now in our time period that we live in, we're seeing the American movement for Christianity to kind of consume and take over government. So that's what this is about. But it deals with the hierarchy of the individual, the identity of people. And I wanted to point this out. In The Handmaid's Tale, we see people that are labeled, you are a commander, you are a wife. And then there's all these other like labels that identify what people are supposed to do. This is your identity. And there's some really, really, really strong identities, especially women who have been put in control of other women. And it's just really horrible. The Aunts and the Marthas, of this culture, the way Atwood kind of does this, it is unbelievable. One of the things that I think the book really does is it points out this idea that Americans even have today. Better never means better for everyone. It also means worse for some. And I think that people will say, hey, you know what, but things are better. And it may not be better for everybody, but it's better. And I think that's scary. And I think that's something that we have to combat. We've got to work towards that. Um, in this article by Todd Beaton and George Takei, who I absolutely love, they talk about The Handmaid's Tale, and they compare it and discuss it to today and the rising, Christian nationalistic movement that's happening. And so, one of the things that I found to be interesting that they pointed out was our current politicians, that are saying these crazy things. Lauren Boebert is one of the people that they point out. I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk. And I think this is very scary. That the idea that people cannot worship who they want and how they want, or people who don't want to worship at all, people who are not religious, their voices are going to be silenced. And certainly this article takes this on. And again, it heightens my argument about the detriments of nationalism in our country today. So we must welcome and encourage discourse, debate, reflection on the necessity of critical social justice. So as I come to the end of my presentation, I want again to reiterate that effective critical social justice pedagogy will indeed challenge mainstream opinions, and in do so will challenge our very identities. And that is my essential argument, is that there is a way that we can fight this. History, the lessons of history can do this. Literature, past and current, that can do it. And, we need to listen when the teacher speaks. People need to have a sense of respect for education, being educated, and we have to really, really push that, because I think that's one of the reasons why this is happening, is that there's been an attack on education. We don't want educators telling us how to feel or what to do. Well, critical social justice is one of the things that they're attacking. And I think that's got to be something that we continue to use as our weapon to stop this. So, in conclusion, Something that I feel is really important about this and the lessons, hopefully, that I've emphasized. We are individual, we see things differently. Society and government serve everybody. We should emphasize love and compassion for all. I don't think this is a religious value only. I think this is a human value, and I think that's how we need to approach it. I think we need to focus on reserving judgment of others. Um, I think that we need to look at actions and words and how those actions and words oppose love and compassion for all. And I think that's where judgment, in my opinion, is necessary. We need to communicate to educate. We have to speak up. We have to make sure that we're doing these things. We have to remember that we are all human beings and we are rotating on this sphere that we call Earth, and we're simply finding our way to be happy, to live, and to experience life to its fullest. And again, we go back to Thomas Jefferson and that little idea, which was so profound. So, one of my favorite writers of all time, Oscar Wilde. Everyone may not be good, but there's always something good in everyone. Never judge anyone shortly because every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. I really, really do try to live my life that way. I really try very, very hard not to judge people, on those things because everybody's got mistakes and has a past, and, everybody has a future no matter what they've done. I just know that my future as an educator is going to be hopefully serving my students to make them better human beings. And I think that's really the whole purpose of this. So I want to thank you for your time. I hope you know that I've really enjoyed your class. I really enjoyed this project. And I wanted to say thank you very much. My research, here are the sources that I used. And then here are my literary sources. These are the things that I tried to pull in. And again, I wanted to say thank you. I've enjoyed the class, and I really have enjoyed this project, and I hope you have gotten something out of it.